these three distinguished gentlemen the floor, I do have a few notes about upcoming presentations. Next month we'll be meeting here again, as usual, second Saturday of the month. Skip Clark with the B&MRRHS, Boston Street Railway Association, is going to be doing the presentation. Skip's a very, very well-known photographer in this area, I guess around the country. He's promised a pretty good show, very good show. So I hope that we have a good turnout for that. Now, April, we will not be meeting here in April. There will not be a meeting in Woburn. We'll be meeting at the First Congregational Church in Newton Highlands with the Mass Bay Railroad enthusiasts. The date, write it down, is April the 16th. It's in the newsletter and everything else, but just don't forget to show up here the second Saturday of April, because you'll find an empty house, probably a locked door as well. I got a note from Joe LaJoy here. The presentation that night, for those who are interested, and I'm sure a lot of you will be, is Lewis Walter presents Trains of the Boston and Maine Railroad circa 1940. Now, Lou Walter passed away recently, and these are culled from his collection. And I guess there's quite a few nice things here. For instance, Green Mountain Flyer near Prison Point Bridge outbound, the Alouette, the Kennebec Limited Flying Yankee Ambassador, Mountaineer at Wakefield, Streamline Train, moving right along, the Minuteman at Belmont, Pathfinder at Belmont, trip sponsored by the IRA New England Division, Claremont Trains trip, April 19th, 1940. Mayberg Freight out of Hartford. It just goes on. Bridgeton and Harrison. Should be a good show. I'm hoping that we have a good turnout from the B&M Historical Society there, as I know we will. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to the three distinguished gentlemen that I mentioned previously. I was gonna say the three blind mice, but I won't. First, I'd like to introduce, as if he needs an introduction, Donald Robinson. Donald Robinson is a dispatcher currently for the B&M. He's the only one of the three tonight who's still under the employ of the railroad, not retired, I guess.
That's why I have to be careful what I say.
He's got a copy of the rules book in his pocket, so he's not worried about it. Preston Johnson has been former director for the society. Robbie was at one time president of the society. Preston is a 43-year veteran of the B&M. Huh? No, I know you're 42. No, 41. No. 41. I sat here 3 years ago and said you're 41 years.
Don't count today.
Don Hills, again, another one of our founding fathers here at the society. He's a 40-year veteran of the railroad. All three gentlemen finished up their, well, I should say Don's probably going to finish up his career as a dispatcher, as did Preston and Donald Hills before him. And they've promised me a pretty good program tonight. Just talking about, well, you did. All right, look.
Well, I tell you,
This whole thing was Robbie's idea. If it's a failure, it's his fault. That's what I'm going to start out with.
with about 7 other ex-dispatchers in the room, along with a dispatcher trainee, we kind of had
watch their tongues.
System when it was in Amherst. And we got them together one night, just as we three are here, and got them started telling stories. And it was literally laughter from one end of the evening to the other. We had the local paper there and tape recorders and so forth, and put that down for the archives. And that was really where I got the idea that maybe this would be the type of program that could go over. So now, Don, you got anything to offer?
Well, not much, no, really.
Yes, this is Junior man.
Yeah, but nothing happened when I worked.
Tell us about when you were off.
You didn't make a few things happen in all those years?
Well, outside of derailing an engine one night at the hump, that kind of got the train master upset, especially during World War II. At Mystic Junction on the 3rd trek, back in 1943, was quite busy, as you can imagine, because as fast as trains would come in, they would have to be let off by the car inspectors. Then the engine put on the rear, and this was still in the days of steam. We had two engines, Class H, B&M called them. They were in the 600 class. 648 and the 649, you rail fans would know about it. They had booster tenders. And the yard master downstairs hollered hump switch, and I'm sitting over at the telegraph desk sending what we know as an X7, which was a freight train consist report. We used to have to send those to different places, wherever the train was headed, so that people would know on the line what the train had in its consist. So I'm sitting down there sending that on the telegraph, and the yard master hollers, hump switch! So I had to get out of my seat, go up, throw the lever for the hump switch, and being in a hurry to send the X7, I just simply looked up, flipped the lever, and the next thing I hear was a screech, and I looked out and I saw sparks flying. I said, oh, for crying out loud. And one of the booster trucks on the tender went off. Tied the place up for about 3 hours, and it was a yard master. He was not trained. He was a yard master at that time, come flying up the stairs ready to tear my ears off. I think I'd been in the tower about 4 nights. So I was only about 19 years old, and being fairly new on the job, I was sure I was going to get fired on the spot. Well, the yard master downstairs, a pretty good scout, he hollered up and he says, hey, he says, it wasn't the kid that did that. He says, I hollered before the engine was clear. So then the fellow turned around, went back downstairs, and I heard no more about it. But I breathed a sigh of relief when he hollered, I'll tell you. From that moment on, he was my friend. Then there was other times. I remember working in Reading one day. We used to run specials from Maine into Boston for the baseball fans. About I think this was around the 4th of July. It was for one of the holidays in the summer. It was the 4th of July, then the next holiday is Labor Day, so I'm going to say it was the 4th of July. And this train came roaring down through. You could stand at the bay window in Reading and look up the track towards Reading Highlands and watch the train come around under the bridge, come around the curve under the bridge there, and then come across Woburn Street crossing, roaring through town at 70 miles an hour. People living in Reading today couldn't even imagine such a thing. But however,
There was one thing, those crossing tenders never waited for the red on the bell. They put them down when the yellow came on.
right. Anyway, while I was standing there at the window, the dispatcher's phone rang. So I walked around the desk, answered the dispatcher, and he wanted to know if the extra was by, and I said, well, just a second, you'll hear it. So I kept my foot on the pedal, and he heard the train go by. But while the train went by, I heard something go crash, and I looked, and here's the window broken, right where I had been standing. I said to him, well, something just came hurtling through the window as the train went by, and I don't know if some piece of brake shoe or something came flying off the train or what it was. So I went about my business. What I was doing was cashing up for the end of the day for my tickets, getting ready to transfer to the second trick. And about 15 minutes later, when I kneeled down to put things away in the safe, I saw a baseball under the safe. I'm glad I wasn't standing at that window when it came through.
Might have hurt.
Yeah, I'm afraid it would have hit me right in the chest. Yes?
Well, tonight, 47 years ago tonight, was quite a night on the B&M, just about this time of night, too. So I started out to work third trick at Winchester, and I took the train from Shawsheen that left Shawsheen about 8:30 at night for Boston. We left Shawsheen right on time, snowing real hard, but those days didn't bother at that stage of the game. We got into the North Station just about on time. I went over and got on the 9:50 train to go out to Winchester, and we left the North Station a few minutes late, and the tail end just about cleared the drawbridge, and we stopped. So we sat there about 35, 40 minutes or so, and then they shoved us back into the station. And that's where the ball game ended. The Gull left at 9:30, and that was the last train out of the North Station until the next day. And to compound the problem, this was the night that Sonia Heine was playing in the Boston Garden, and when her show let out about 10:30, there was a capacity house that had no place to go. The Boston Elevated, that used to be the Boston Elevated, not the MBTA. The Boston Elevated was pretty well tied up. The railroad was completely tied up. And one of the causes, this was the first test of putting in gas burners for the switches at Tower A. And this blizzard just snuffed them out. They didn't have any skunk oil around, so they could burn them out, and the men couldn't keep up with them. So Tower A was completely paralyzed. Once you get out of Tower A, you're in pretty good shape. So this, I was criticized by the assistant superintendent for not leaving earlier, because I did get to Winchester at 5:15 the next afternoon. So I could cover the second trip. It wasn't too bad because the trains that I should have had on third trip were just coming then. So anyway, to show what a problem it was, because this was all steam power, and the Boston Fire Department sent 2 pumps over to keep the tenders full of water so they didn't have to dump the fires. 62, which was a Troy Boston train, went by Tower H right on time, and he arrived in the North Station 8 hours late. He sat at pole 10, which is where the Fitchburg goes around the corner there onto the rest of the tracks at the engine house. 8 solid hours they sat out there at a red signal. The little switcher, the 227, I think it was, that used to take a couple of the baggage cars off of one of the trains and set them over on the Nashway Street, the furthest track over on Nashway Street. I think that engine was in there for 3 or 4 days. They got in there and they just forgot it. They dumped the fire and left it there with the baggage cars. But this was one of the worst storms that the B&M had, and they still mention. In fact, I'm surprised there hasn't been something in some of the newspapers looking back through the years. But that was my real first big snowstorm to be actually tied up and getting to work. Because most always you could use the trains ran very close to on time. When I started on the railroad, I worked first trick at Salem Tower on Christmas Day in 1939. And a lot of people would say, you talk to them in later years, well, you're going to be off Christmas? And I says, no, I started to work on Christmas Day, and I've had 7 Christmases off in 43 years. Why make it a habit? When we started in, it was, I kind of got interested in the towers through a dog, because I used to spend quite a bit of time at Lawrence Roundhouse. I lived in Shawsheen, and I could walk over there, and I always took care of the neighbor's dog, and take a walk along the track, and watch the engines and things like that. And there was a guy working in the tower, and some of you people knew him. His name was Tuba, Herman Tuba. In fact, he's just passed away here within the last 2 or 3 years. And he was very interested in the dog, so he invited me to come up into old JK Tower, and I kind of got interested. They weren't hiring firemen, because they didn't hire firemen until 1941, and to be a fireman, you had to have a father that was a fireman or an engineer, because almost all the older engineers, you notice they all had their fathers worked here at one time. So I kind of got interested in that, and telegraph. And there was another man there, and I know some of you fellas in the back row remember him, Bill Comer. And Billy says, you know, they're looking for towermen in the terminal division. I heard him talking on the wire the other night. So Bob Chaffin, who was a rail fan, we both went in and we hired out, and we flunked the wire test the first time around. But then the next time they realized we were new and they didn't just sit you down and plug you in on some fella that was sending, they sent a couple of messages to us. So on Christmas Day, 1939, I worked first trick at Salem and Bob worked second trick at Rockport, but I had him by 6 hours, which didn't really amount to too much because I don't think there was any job that I took that he wanted. So that's how it got started. You got something to say?
Well, yeah, I suppose now I'd better. Of course, this has gone back a little before dispatching with both of them, so I suppose I might as well too. And
This is a historical society, you know.
well, I tell you, I actually started my career, perhaps unofficially, as a crossing watchman at Waverly. I was qualified on operating the gates there when I was 10 years old. But specifically, actually, the first paycheck I got from the B&M, and I still have it somewhere, I got at Waverly. And I think it was for a total amount of 36 cents. At that time, the crossing watchman pay was 40 cents an hour. And I was given 1 hour for emergency crossing protection. I'd done it many times. This time the agent, who incidentally used to come to these meetings quite frequently, Clayton Patnod, decided to put my time in, and was he ever sorry? I think he was answering correspondence for something like 6 months. I was underage. I didn't have a social security number. I didn't have a work permit from my parents. I didn't have a work permit from my school. Oh, I'm telling you, all the things that man went through to get me a paycheck for 36 cents was somewhat ridiculous. The next job I had was carrying mail between the station at Belmont and Belmont Post Office and the station. That was only 2 hours a night. There are a lot of stories I could tell about that too, but I'm not going to. And then again, I worked as a crossing watchman during summer vacations from college until I graduated, and then went on as by that time hired out as an operator. The first job they sent me to was Johnsonville. And I had to get qualified first, of course, before I could take the job. I put in 3 16-hour days in order to get qualified, because there was another man who had taken the telegraph test the same day I did. Well, he did get ahead of me. They sent him the second of those 3 days up to Westminster, Vermont to be agent for 1 day, and that put him on the roster ahead of me. Again, like Preston was saying, it never bothered, because he and I didn't like the same kind of jobs. He was only around for about 3 or 4 years and quit anyway. But Johnsonville used to be a very interesting place to work, because of course that was one end of the left-handed running, and everything had to cross over no matter which way it was going. It either had to cross from right hand to left hand or left hand to right hand, with the Troy branch going off there and all the passenger trains. And I had, one day I had BT1 coming west. He had to go down, he had some cars to pick up on the west end of the Troy Middle. And right behind him was a hot shot for Mechanicsville. And it was, is BT1 going to clear the crossover so I can run that other guy, or isn't he? And he kept slowing down, slowing down, slowing down. I heard the air go on, and he was still in the crossover. Bang went the air, the slack ran in, and the buggy cleared the circuit. I don't think he could have cleared that circuit by more than 3 inches, but he couldn't. And I was able to run my train. Of course, that whole west end, even later on, was interesting somewhat too. I'll go back to one more story at Johnsonville, mainly for the benefit of Ralph Hamer, because there used to be an order had to be put out every night for the 2 trains off the Rutland, or on and off the Rutland. Because going onto the branch, up the branch from Hoosick Junction to North Bennington was the superior direction. And the train coming off the branch was just 3 minutes earlier at Hoosick Junction than the train going on the branch. So every night, 5603 had to be given right over 5600 from North Bennington to Hoosick Junction. Well, Johnsonville had a speaker, so the dispatcher would never bother to ring Johnsonville or even make sure he was listening. The operator up at North Bennington would come in, say Rutland 52 was on time. The dispatcher would ring Troy and start putting out the order. To Troy to CD number 5600, Johnsonville to the operator. North Bennington, CD number 5603. Number 5603 has right over number 5600. North Bennington to Hoosick Junction. GWB, which was the Superintendent, George Blake, the superintendent at the time. Well, we didn't always stay awake on the 3rd trick. And I was up on the supply cabin. And I came to just in time to hear the operator down at Troy say, ICK, JCT, GWB. And I knew it was my turn to repeat. I hadn't heard a bit of the dictation of the order, but I'd been there about a week and it was always number 1. And in that one leap from the supply cabin and into the chair, the thought went through my mind, I'll say it's number 1, and if he tells me it was any different, I'll say, oh, I got used to number 1 and I just wrote it down. Well, I went through the order from a completely blank table. He completed it after North Bennington's repeat, so number 1 was all right. He never knew the difference until years later when I told him about it. And leading up to that, that West End used to be great on the 3rd trip. Earl McCarty was asleep in the dispatcher's chair in Greenfield. George Rhodes, of course known as Dusty, was asleep slumped over the machine at the desk of the machine at North Adams Tower. Roy Martin was asleep up on the supply cabinet at Johnsonville. Agnes Foley was asleep in the chair at Mechanicville Yard Office. I was stretched out back of the levers at Crescent, and High Holt was asleep on the desk out at Rotterdam.
It was a real graveyard trick.
Oh yes, that was a graveyard trick, all right. And to go on with another one out to Crescent, the desk was set up on one end of the tower, one corner, with a little machine on the end of it to control the CTC section between Burnt Hills and Scotia. There were just the 2 switches and 2 signals were all there were to it. And then you had this big long row of mechanical levers for the switches and signals at Crescent. And back of them on the interlocking bed was covered up with a varnished board setup that they had put in there. And that was where I used to sleep. And from back there, I could not reach over that CTC machine and punch the cutout bells for the cutout button for the approach bells. Now the approach bells cut out 3 different ways. They had this set of push buttons over the desk so that if you couldn't clear the signal for the train, if you don't have to stop it, you could push the button and that would stop the approach bell from ringing. Or when you pulled the lever over to clear the signal, it would stop the bell from ringing. Or if you had the signal already cleared, when he hit the approach, the bell would ring about 4 strokes and then stop. And at the time, Crescent had to get the yarding instructions from Mechanicville for all eastbound trains and hang a number in the window. So to make sure these trains wouldn't get by me without getting the number hung up there, I naturally left the signal lever in the stop position. And this particular night, I woke up to footsteps on the stairs. And it was the head brakeman, and there was a headlight down at the home signal. Now, when I got up out of there, that signal lever was still in the stop position, and the bell was not ringing. And the only thing I can think of is that without waking up, I got up, walked all the way around those levers, punched the cutout button, went right back around.
You can write a book about the third trick with all the experiences that people had, and they also had another book of all the excuses you could use if you got caught sleeping. And I remember one time on third trick at Salem, they had a crossing tender down there, each trick beside the towerman. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, there used to be an engine come out of the engine house that made 2401 that went up to Danvers. And so I was laying up on the desk there, and as you laid on the desk, you sort of faced the engine house. And I heard this bell ringing, and I looked out, and I could see this headlight. So I jumped off the desk, and I shook the crossing tender, and I says, come on, here comes the switcher. He's going to the yard. And I pulled in the signal. The crossing tender put the gates down, they had a big gong, and the gates went down. And then he said to me, he said, I think the switcher went in a couple of hours ago into the yard. I said, you know, I think you're right. So we put the gates up, and I never forget the face on the hood milkman that was waiting at the gates. He saw the gates go down, they stayed down like 2 or 3 minutes, then they went up again, just sort of shook his head. What's going on in this place? But there was always, third trick always had its, I don't know, it was a busy time. Speaking of third trick, this is what they call a stripper. The yard clerks used them. Today they have a computer. But anyway, this was on March 21st, 1941. And I was covering third trick at Mystic, and I kept a lot of these things, and I still have them, and they'll go to the society. But starting at 11:10 until I went home at 7 o'clock in the morning, we had 14 trains come into Mystic, with a total of 928 cars. And when you consider, of course, these are smaller 40-foot cars. They're not like the tonnage that they haul today with the big 85-footers and such things as that. These are just small trains. But when you stop to consider, like we had an RB2 from Mechanicville and a Deerfield Extra, these are all steam engines, like the 4007, 4013, RB4, the 4020, another Deerfield Extra with a K8, the 2648, but he still had 75 cars. Then the milk train came in. Then he had 352 with 14 cars of milk and 10 more freight on the rear, UB2 from White River, XB2 from Bellas Falls, PB4 from Rigby, MB6 from Mechanicville, another Deerfield Extra with a Mudsucker 3004, B12 from Rigby, WB2 from Worcester, 490 from White River, and a Haverhill Boston Extra we didn't have room for. When I went home, they were waiting at Wilmington for a track. But they used to use 2 humpers on each side, and in the cold weather, if they couldn't start them with one, they went down with a second one. And that was it's too bad we didn't have tape recorders in those days, because when you sat in Mystic Tower and those 2 600s went by you, wide open, double-headed, Donald will tell you, because he worked there quite a bit too, the old tower rocked back and forth. And just for the heck of it, you'd get on the dispatcher's phone sometime, put your foot down while they were going by, So, and there'd be some rail fan towerman or something come on the wire and say, gee, that sounds good. We used to do that at Tower C when they went to Mystic Wharf with a 600. They whistled from Main Street to Wilkett Avenue. Just about the time he cleared the diamond, 3 o'clock in the morning, he'd whistle for the crossings there. And they really had a kind of a banshee whistle, but it was kind of nice. And I'd put my foot on the pedal there, and you'd hear it go over the dispatcher's phone to Dover like that. And there was one certain guy there out in Lawrence there, George Etchcombe, and he'd come on the wire. That sounds good.
Well, to get up into the dispatching era with something that Preston just talked about, we had a new dispatcher came over onto the Fitchburg Division when Fern Marcoux came over. And it was just about at the end of the steam on the Central Vermont. B&M's had been out for quite a while, but the CB had been running an occasional one. And I was working third trick Conn River, and I forgot what prompted the thing, but at that time we had two locals, one from East Deerfield to White River, the other from White River to East Deerfield, which ran via Dole Junction, Keene, Bellows Falls. And they usually met at Keene. So the Conn River dispatcher would put out the order, but in addition to the operators at Greenfield and Bellows Falls copying the order, the Gardner dispatcher would also copy it and put it in his train order book because it was partially his territory. So we decided to have a little fun with Fern, and I brought down my record player and a record and get over on another phone. And while Bellows Falls was repeating the order, we played this train that supposedly was going by Bellows Falls. Well, it didn't faze Marcoux one little bit. In fact, he said afterwards he didn't even realize what the noise was up in the background. But the fellow that was third trick operator up in White River Yard office fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And just by accident, not by design, but by accident, it had happened that 491 with diesels was in the area at about the same time. So we had to find an excuse for him as to why 491 didn't have a steam engine on it. And the operator at Bellows Falls picked it up. After the train had gotten by, the Diamond Man just came in with a note, because that was when they still had the ball signal there. The Diamond Man just came in with a note from that 491. He said that steam engine's got a hot driver pin. They're not sure they're going to be able to make White River. They may have to set it off at Windsor. Well, of course, they did set it off at Windsor. And meanwhile, we'd gotten hold of the yardmaster up in the yardmaster at White River called down and wanted to know what in hell was going on, because this guy was all over him about the steam engine coming up. So we told him what the story was. He calls up the operator up at the CV yard. He comes in on the phone and wants to know where that train is with the steam engine on it. He's got a couple of rail fans there looking for it. Well, of course, the engine with the hot driver pin got set off at Windsor. And it happened that it was this operator's, the next 2 days were his days off. And while he was off, the engine went north. So, a month or two went by, and we decided to do it up Brown this time. We got everybody in on it in advance. And this time, we matched it with 491. And as a matter of fact, the operator at East Northfield even had the dispatcher's office in New London plugged in on it, which the southern division of the CV was down there then. And so they supposedly go by East Northfield, and Patterson comes in on the phone and he says, "Damn it," he says, "you know, it's been so long since I hooked up orders to a steam engine, I forgot to turn down my hat brim and put up my coat collar, and my back's full of cinders." So we waited until they were getting out of Brattleboro, and we played them getting out of Brattleboro. And about the time they should have been going by Westminster, the operator at Bellows Falls comes in on the phone. He says, "Just got a call from Rutland." And he said, the engine for 119 is broken down over in the Fitchburg yard. They've made arrangements with the CV to take that steam engine. So 491 works its way up by Bellows Falls, and you can hear cars going by and cars going by and cars going by. And a little while later, this light engine comes chuff, 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 chuff. And maybe half an hour goes by. We had 119 going out of Bellows Falls headed for Rutland. And of course, that went back to the CV by way of Burlington and Essex Junction. So Poor guy up there at White River, he never did get to see his steam engine. And sometime later, I saw him personally up the White River and told him, he asked me about this thing. I thought, that was nothing but a record. Oh no, he said, I know a steam engine when I hear it. He did, no question about it. He heard a steam engine, but I never was, until the day he died, was ever able to convince that man that he'd been listening to a phonograph record.
What do you say, Don? You must have something.
Well, going back to being an operator, I remember one night working Winchester Tower. This is again the trick. And at Winchester, with the furnace downstairs, we had a sort of a one-pipe deal, and you almost sat over the thing. It was coal-fired, and it was a cold night, similar to what we've got here. And Mystic Junction reported a light engine for Lowell. So I thought, well, looked at the clock, and I got plenty of time to go downstairs. I'll line up for them. Go up the main line, and I'll go downstairs and stoke the fire, and by the time I come up, I'll still have time to see them go by and report them and so forth. So I went down, stoked up the fire, came back upstairs, sat down on the chair, and the next thing I know, I hear Benny Lassell, the dispatcher in Concord Hall of Winchester Tower. Yes, sir. Did the light engine go by you yet? I almost said no when I looked up on the machine, and the home signal at Winchester would stay red. That one wouldn't repeat, but all the others would. And we also had a dark area between Montvale and South Wilmington where we had no track indicator on the board to tell us whether anything was in there or not. I thought, well, he's evidently gone by Winchester, but where in hell is he? So I'm waiting for him to hit the OS bell at South Wilmington and then subtract about 7 minutes and tell him what time he went by me. But the next thing I hear is the operator at Lowell Tower says, well, he just hit my bell. And holy sucking cat, he went all the way through the plant, and at every place he goes through the plant, the bell would ring. I didn't hear the bell, nothing. To this day, I can't understand how I missed him. What it was, the heat from the furnace that put me to sleep, or what?
You sound like the George Rhodes that I mentioned up there to North Adams. He'd go sound asleep over the desk. And he was supposed to OS Soapstone, East Portal, West Portal, and Williamstown. Well, 63, which was the Mail and Express train, had station time at North Adams. If he was late, he might not use all of the scheduled time, or there were times when he used considerably more than his regular station time, particularly around Christmas. And George, the train would wake him up as it went by the tower, and by the process of elimination that John just mentioned, he'd give Mac the times at Soapstone, East Portal, and West Portal. Then he'd go back to sleep. The next thing you know, he'd wake up and the train was gone off the machine. He had no idea when it had gone by Williamstown. Well, this particular night, he'd gone back to sleep. The next thing, Johnsonville comes in, and Roy Martin, OS 63, Hoosick Junction, Eagle Bridge, and Johnsonville. Well, one thing you could depend on was it was exactly a half an hour from Williamstown to Hoosick Junction. So Mac says, hello, George. Never holler at him more than once. Hello, George. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. 63 Williamstown. George had no idea what time they'd gone by Williamstown. Well, we had a local telegraph wire, 14 wire, went everything from Greenfield to Mechanicville. Went in every place there was, including the dispatcher's position. So Roy just reached over and he didn't call North Adams, he didn't sign Johnsonville, he just made a time. George picked it right up and gave it to Mac. Mac says, good thing somebody west of was awake. Come on, Press, you're falling behind behind here.
Donald,
I remember working down to Salem Tower one other night. We used to have a crossing tender in the tower in those days, because Bridge Street ran right by the tower there. This is before they lengthened the tower out and made all the changes that you've got down there today. And there was a bright light, street light outside the tower. And the crossing tender, he was laid back there, kind of snoring, going to sleep over the engine house over and back of us. We still had steam locomotives. The hostler over there put one out on the table, and he rang the bell, and the crossing tender wakes up, sees the bright light, and he thinks it's the train. He jumps out of his chair, puts the gates down, then he gets the gates down, looks around. Where's the train? I said, well, you heard a train in back of you. Oh, for God's sake. He put the gates back on. Funniest thing to see that guy jump out of the chair and put the gates down and let him come.
More than one crossing watchman has done that.
Another time I was working at Salem, and I didn't realize I was getting the crossing tenders down at Norman Street all upset. There was no gates down there. The old station used to have a little office in one corner. And they had, what, three men there. Yeah, three men. Used to come running out with their signs or lanterns, depending upon the time of day. And to stop the traffic for the train to go in towards Boston, if the bell was that way. Anyhow, as the train went out this particular day, going through the tunnel, going eastbound, I used to have a couple of close moves at Northey Point, which was the end of double track sort of there. It was always single track from Northey Point through the tunnel into the station. And we had a signal. We just pull the lever up, and it would clear the signal right at the tower for a westbound move. And I thought, well, if I pull that signal up as the rear end of the eastbound train goes by, when when I pull the signal at Northey Point, it'll come in green right away instead of being yellow. I said that would give the engineer a better indication. So I was doing that for a couple of hours if I had close moves. The next thing I know, about 10 o'clock at night, the signal maintainer comes along. I says to him, I says, gee, George, who called you up? Well, he says, the crossing tenders were reporting they were getting a false bell. He says that the eastbound train would go, and about 4 minutes later, he says, the bell would ring again, and they'd run out and stop all the traffic and wait for the train to come, and nothing would show up until about 5 minutes later. Then the train would come along, and they wondered what's going on. I got to thinking, I said, well, wait a minute, George. Would this have any bearing on it? And I told him what I was doing. For crying out loud, he says, I've been chasing that circuit for 2 hours.
speaking of those crossing tenders, those of you that remember them, on a cold night like this, they all look like a bunch of Russian immigrants there with the big fur coats, old coats wrapped up around it, huddled together in this downstairs in the tower at the east end of the Salem station. Then, of course, when the bell rang, they'd come out. At night, they had lanterns, and during the day, they had the stick with the stop signs that went 2 ways. And there were 3 of them to cover that crossing. And I know a friend of mine there that is now passed on, Wayne Brumbaugh. The first time he went down to Salem, and he'd done a lot of traveling and seen a lot of railroading, he couldn't even believe that. But he said, when you see that, and then see a 440 going by with 3 open-end wooden coaches, you've really gone back a long, long way. But back in the olden days, I think the thing that, I was looking through some things the other night that came out of the dispatcher's office up in Dover. And one was a book that the chief kept up there with all the instructions on what to do with passenger trains. And of course, the Portland Division was the passenger railroad, where the Fitchburg was the freight railroad. And a couple of things that kind of struck me as being kind of interesting is the fact that there was a note there in the summertime that the train master in Boston At about 6 o'clock in the morning, he would go out and he would ascertain if it was going to be a nice day at the beach. And if it looked like it was going to be a good day, you immediately set up an advanced section of 1005, which left Boston around 9 a.m. for Portland, and you set another set of equipment in there of 6 air-conditioned coaches, a baggage car, and a P2 engine. And then that was figuring that 1005 would be too many people on there, so they'd run this advanced section. And there was a little notation that said, if the boys guess wrong one way or the other, there'll be no execution. Well, you knew where that came from, because we had a general manager at that time, I guess he was probably general superintendent. His name was Frank Rook. Now, he had a way, he was a great railroad man, and he had a way of getting his point across. The time that WM1 went up the Peterborough branch and ran head-on into 8164, which that particular Sunday, it happened to be in a little rail fan excursion for the enthusiasts out of Worcester, and they'd gone to Peterborough and they were on their way back on 8164. They were running about, I think they were 20 minutes late. They gave him a couple of orders at Barber's there. They hooped him on 8164, run 20 minutes late, and his run on. Well, the fellas on the mudsucker there, they just kept right on going, and they don't know what, I guess they didn't pay much attention to what they were doing, because in those days, Frank Rook would explain these accidents, and I still have a copy of the notice, the bulletin notice. So it told about the accident, and as it was, they saw each other, so they made a hard hitch. It didn't do the mogul much good, but nobody really got hurt. Anyway, he ended up this thing. He said something about the crew of WM1. They picked up their orders at Barber's, and they didn't really know where they were going, but actually they were headed for that hot place you read about in Sunday school. He was the type of man that you could call him up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and he'd wake right up and he would grasp the entire situation. Like the morning that 302 tipped over in Nashway, he could ask you 40 questions. What are you doing with the trains? They're going via the Manchester branch. They're going to do this. They're going to do that. And he was very, very sharp. I got kind of a funny story about Frank Rook. He started as a dispatcher up in Woodsville. And the same guy that hired me to go dispatching, P.Y. Leonard, hired Frank Rook. In fact, Frank Rook roomed with P.Y. up there in Woodsville before he climbed the ladder. So anyway, they were going to have a fan trip, a railroad enthusiast trip to Portland, and it was going to be a P4 engine. Well, I knew if I didn't get a chance to ride on a P4 again, I'd kick myself. So I used to see him in the morning in the North Station going out for coffee. And I approached him one morning there and told him who I was, and of course I had to use PY's initials. I said, well, I work for PY and one thing or other. Well, good old PY, how's he doing and all that stuff. So I said, you know, Mr. Rook, I'd love to ride. So anyway, Frank says, yeah, you go upstairs to such and such, I think his name was Buck or something like that, and tell him to write you out a message with my signature giving you permission to ride on the engine on that passenger train. So I thanked him and I went up there. Well, I tell you, when I went into that office and I told him what Frank Rook had told me, I tell you, they went behind the scenes and they were whispering. The first thing they figured, there was nobody had nerve enough to ask Frank Rook, and they were afraid if they did have nerve enough to ask him, and he said yes, and they didn't give me the letter, they were going to get hecked. So they didn't know what, if they gave me the letter, it was bad. If they didn't give me the letter, it was bad. So anyway, I got the letter and enjoyed the ride. But one of the things that I think really, working for the railroad, I think the thing that really was a lot of fun, in the days of steam, you got little privileges of, shall we say, that everybody didn't get. I know I rode 23 one time on the 3710 express Boston to Portland. We got into Portland 20 minutes ahead of time, because once you left Dover, it was CTC, and they just put their tail right up over their back and headed for Rigby. And one morning there, I was working in Concord, and 302 came down with 4116, which was rare. Somehow it got to White River, and that's how they were going to work it to Boston. So I got through work, and I went down, got up on the engine. George Spear was the road foreman. He says, "What are you doing here?" And I says, "Well," I said, "take a ride to Boston with you there." And he says, "Why don't you come around someday when there's a diesel?" Well, of course, that's just what I didn't want to do. It's a diesel. So I said, "George," I says, I says, "if I don't review the road this morning, today, I'm going to get pulled out of service." So I got to ride this train to Boston. So he says, "Okay, go over and sit down." So that was the only time I ever rode an R1 on a passenger train. So you had to work all these little deals in one way or another. Another thing with PY, when PY was dispatching to Woodsville, he had a fellow by the name of Moriarty worked up there, and he became superintendent of the Eastern Division of the Maine Central. So I was down at Bangor one day so I could get a ride on the engine from Portland to Vancouver. Another time I rode the scoop. I was going to ride the scoop from Brownville Junction over to Megantic, and I went in to see the superintendent up there, and he was one of the guys that worked at Lyndonville, and when they merged in 26, or the CP took over, he stayed with the CP instead of staying with the B&M. Well, of course, he knew PY. So when I told him about that, he said, "You know," he says, "you don't want to ride the scoop." He says, he wrote me out a message. He says, "You ride the caboose of 951, the paper train." He says, "We'll give you a good ride up through the country. When you get to Mechanic," he says, "you just show this message to the superintendent up there or the agent." I says, "He'll fix you up so you can ride it through to Sherbrooke." So this was some of the little fringe benefits that you got by working on the railroad. And I think with the pass privilege we used to have, Mrs. Buckland, she used to take care of the passes, and she used to shake her head when you come in with 14 pass applications, from Boston to New York, and then instead of going on the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, you had to go to Baltimore, and then the Maryland and Pennsylvania, and then some other way, and coming home, you'd ride on the Western Pacific, the Butte Anaconda and Pacific, the Union Pacific. She said, "Can't you go in a direct line?" Why? So you really could, I think the B&M was known on almost every railroad in the United States, at least through exchange of at least one guy was using a trip pass on this, on these other railroads.
Press mentioned Frank Rourke getting his point across. I had a copy of the bulletin. I don't know whatever happened to it. It got lost somewhere along the way. But I still remember it. It was headed up that he had been getting complaints from passengers about dirty coaches. And inquiring of the conductors, they had told him that they had made the reports as required to the car inspectors. The cars just hadn't been getting cleaned. So the bulletin went on to say, "In the future, the following procedure will be followed. You will make your first report as usual to the foreman car inspector. If nothing is done, you will make a second report with a copy to the superintendent of car service. If there are still no results, you will make a third report with a copy to me. There will be no need for a fourth report." Preston also mentioned BW1. BW1's engineer for a good many years was Fred Hatfield, who lived in Waverly. And Fred Hatfield knew only two positions on the throttle of a T1. If it wasn't closed, it was wide open. Well, I happened to be staying with one of my aunts out in South Lancaster one night when the fire whistle sounded. And it was the ice house down on the pond. It was in the middle of winter like this, and South Lancaster couldn't get their engine started, so they called for Lancaster. Lancaster came down, proceeded to get stuck in the snow. So they called for Clinton. Clinton came over, and instead of dropping the man with the hose and coupling it to the hydrant and then paying it off the engine as they went in, they run all the way into the fire down the driveway and then have to drag the hose back out by hand. Well, they got water on the fire, but it was right there near, if any of you are familiar with the bridge where the WNP goes over Route 12. And Route 12 is not all that wide. There were not only fire trucks and spectators, but call men, various other people, and with traffic pretty much limited to one lane through all this mess of, anybody that really wanted to go through, not only were they limited by the cars parked there, but the fact that there was only one pair of boards to use as hose jumpers because the hydrant was on the far side of the street. So the Clinton chief told some of his men to take about 4 lengths of hose and run it up over the railroad bridge. Well, he had it so thoroughly in his mind to put the hose under the rails that he never thought to tell them. He figured they'd know it too. So up they went, strung the new line, just got it shut down the old line, cut in the new hose, just got water back on the fire again, and Fred whistled for the crossing up in Lancaster. The chief, then he turned to these men, he said, of course you put that hose under the rails. Oh no, we just strung it across the Well, the chief grabbed the lantern off the engine and he headed up, I never saw anybody run any faster in my life than he did. Right up the bank onto the track and up the track toward Thayer Station. When he got to where Fred could see him, Fred was only about a quarter mile away and coming like the hammers of hell. It only took about one swing of that lantern, Fred acknowledged it and dumped the air. When he stopped, the front coupler on that T1 was just about that far from 2.5-inch hose, fully charged and strung across girders like this. And any of you that know anything about fire hoses know what would have happened if he'd hit it, particularly at speed.
Speaking of Fred Hatfield, the best job, I think the most interesting job I ever had on the railroad as far as rail fan business was concerned was second trick at Tower H. Because you got all the freights and you, everything went by Tower H, I guess, except the 4-4 roads, because even the Flying Yankee turned on the Y and came out to Tower H. The Montreal trains turned on the Y. You had B&As. When they'd have a troop movement there, 8 or 9 B&A passing troop extras going over to East Boston to a ship and stuff like that. The place was bustling all the time. So I get kind of acquainted with Fred Hatfield. He'd come out with his engine there. Sometimes you couldn't take him into the yard to get his train. So he and I got kind of chummy. So he had a head-end man by the name of Supple, Johnny Supple. That was a Fitchburg Division engine crew and the New Hampshire Division train crew, whereas the passenger train, 521, was just the other way around. So anyway, I got kind of friendly with him there, so needless to say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Hit him up for a ride to Worcester and back. So I made 3 trips with him, 2 on 4100s, 1 on a T1. And you could almost, the fireman told me, he says, you can time Fred because it takes 1 White Owl cigar from Worcester to Air and 1 White Owl cigar from Air to Boston. He says that is just the way he runs. And you could just about tell by his running time that this is just about the time he was going to take. He never varied. He was an excellent engineer. And ironically, I went down to see him. I was going down to see him in a nursing home down in Exeter. I used to visit him in Hampton when he was living down there. And the day I got there at 10 o'clock in the morning. He passed on at 9:30. But he was a good engineer. He had a brother, Eddie. And they used to run opposite each other on BT1 and 2nd RB4 from Boston to Deerfield. Eddie was on one night, Fred was on the next night. So there was always a Hatfield on that BT1. And another thing, you might say that in the years that Fred was on the Worcester job, he probably hauled all the PCC cars on his train to Boston, because they all used to come in on WB2. And I think it was a 7-day job, and I think he must have probably hauled them all. But he was a nice man, and he went back to fire. He could tell the days he fired the oil burners in the Hoosick Tunnel before the electrification. That's how far back he went. I think his roster date was something like 1909 when he went firing. But that's another thing that I think, of all the things on the railroad, I think the men and the employees is the thing that you miss. There were so many different guys. Lots of times they got your goat, especially when you were dispatching and some guy, what do I do now? And I can't do this. You know, I get 2.5 hours for doing that. I'm going to time slip you if you pick up here and all that stuff. After a while, you kind of got immune to that. But in most cases, I think everybody did get along, and it was a good thing. I remember one night, 2 bad boo-boos I pulled that were very expensive. 3 bad boo-boos. It's hard to pull 3, isn't it? But anyway, these all involved the operating cruise agreements. One of them, Donald was working. B-10 showed up at Concord one night, and they ran out of water on their diesel. So they were going to can. They didn't have much time to get to Boston. So the logical thing to do was to put them up. It was a Friday night. Just tie them up there and pick them up tomorrow with some job or something like that. And then have the fire department come down, and one booster tank on a fire engine would usually just take care of the cooling tank on a diesel. So Walter Dunn was the engineer, and that was all right. So there was a train due out of Concord, I think about, like, shall we say, 10:22, something like that. These guys went to work at something like 8:25 in the morning or something like that. So anyway, the logical thing to do was to say, okay, tie the engine up, tie the train up. They only had 2 or 3 cars, deadhead to Boston. So we thought that was a bright idea. So when I came to work Monday, Bill Fury said, "What the heck did you tell that crew on B-10 to do?" And I told him. Well, he says, "Take a look at this. Evidently, there was something in the agreement that I had overlooked. If you tied them up in less than 14 hours, they went on continuous time. So the guy was on continuous time until Monday, because the job didn't work Saturday and Sunday." So Bill, every time I used to see Bill, he says, "You'll never get over that one, will you?" I says, "There's one other," I says, "I did one time that was just as bad. The railroad was washed out. There was a flood. I think the Pompey line was washed out. I think the Maine line north. So when 78's crew showed up at Wells River, the conductor said, 'What's my instructions?' But you couldn't go anyplace. The highways were washed out. So he lived in Bath, New Hampshire. His home terminal was Boston, but he lived in Bath, New Hampshire. So, of course, it was a good job for him because most of the time off was on the north end, was at Wells River. So I says, "Why don't you might just as well go home?" Was that a sad mistake? He went on continuous time for about 2 days. So the superintendent says, "Well, why didn't you tell him to deadhead to Boston?" I says, "On what?" He says, "There was no way of anybody getting to Boston." And the 3rd time was on the paper train, number 1. They stalled going up around Ashland someplace, and CO1, the Concord Lincoln local, was up there in the clear, so we took their engine and put the Jeep on the head end of number 1 and double-headed them to Woodsville. And that was the sad thing too, because of course that was a weekend, so that crew went home one of them lived in Lincoln, I guess, the other lived in Campton, so they went home and sat by the fire on continuous pay until Monday, until they got back to work again. All those little boo-boos, but you know, you only did that about once, and then you kind of get wise to it once in a while there. But the old operating agreements, the book of rules was simple compared to the Brotherhood's agreements. They were really complicated. And the funny thing about it, it didn't cost the railroad much money if you broke an operating rule, but you break one of their rules, it was very costly. What do you say, Don?
Well, I don't think I pulled one like that.
Why not?
Of course, I suppose everybody has been sitting here on pins and needles waiting for somebody to tell about a wreck.
I can tell you one.
Go ahead.
Two,
Go ahead.
4. Which one do you want to hear
I don't
about?
know, the one that scared me the most, I'll tell you, was after we'd gotten radios. But before they single-tracked a lot of the Connecticut River line, it was still double-tracked between Putney and Bellows Falls. 732 quite frequently would have to stop at Putney, wait for 733 to clear the single track. And that was what had happened this particular night. 733 had had an order right over 732, West River to Putney. And sitting there and everything was perfectly quiet. 732 and told me they'd arrived at Putney. 733 was going up through there, and all of a sudden I heard 733 yell, 732, look out, we're coming at you. They'd split the spring switch and were headed up between the tracks. Well, when they stopped, they just missed kissing, just by inches that 733 stopped. And then came the fun. We had to back 732 up to Bellows Falls and send them around through Keene and down the Ashland Branch. Get SJ3's power off their train at Brattleboro. Send them up to Putney to pull back the good cars from 733. Run around that, shove it back down to Dole Junction and go north over the Ashland, meet 732 at Keene. Real fun and games.
I knew Frank Rourke personally. Everything you say about him was good.
Right. They used to say if that man smiled, his face would fall off.
Well, Joe put a smile for him.
Oh, Joe Quinn.
All right? I'll take me back a while.
All right, Don, go ahead and tell one.
I'm retired 20 years, and I worked 50.
Good.
Figure it out.
Good for you.
I was up there before they built the Harvard Mystic Junction.
A lot of the fellas
Takes you back to the wild.
retire and then. Well, I'm gonna tell you, one night, the first night I ever worked as a chief train dispatcher was third trick, and Elmer Wing is here. I think he might remember this.
He's running out the door. He must remember it. He's looking for the Johnny's going the wrong
We
way.
had a train out of Portland in those days. I forgot what time it was due out. It was somewhere around midnight. It was RM1 and bound for Mechanicville. It was New Year's Eve. The reason I caught the job because nobody else wanted it. Everybody had booked off for New Year's Eve. Being the low man on the totem pole in the office, I got elected to cover the chief's job. So RM1 came down. We had the hot box detector at Burnt Mill Road up in, where the heck is that, Wells? And Elmer was watching the tape, and holy smokes, about in the middle of the train, the needle on the tape is going away the heck up off the graph for about 6 or 7 cars. We thought, gee whiz, that can't be right. There must have been something go haywire with that. Well, there was an awful lot of snow up there. And when the train came down to the North Berwick, Elmer figured he stopped him at the first signal at North Berwick East. The head end man gets off the engine and walks through the snow up to his waist, and he gets to the telephone, wants to know what in hell Elmer stopped in there for, and Elmer says, well, he says, this graph in here, he says, is gone kind of crazy, he says, but you know and I know that probably nothing wrong, but rules are rules, we gotta see what the trouble is. He says, I'll give you the signal, and you guys can pull down slow and take a look at your journals and see if there's any problem. So he gives them the signal, the train pulls down by, and oh my goodness, right in the middle of the train there was, I don't know, there was at least one car, maybe two, that had no trucks under it. It's riding on the snow. And then they hit another one hit the switch point and broke that all to heck. Finally they got the train stopped. And what had happened was they had burned off the journals, and the trucks just went right out from under the cars. And like I said, the snow being hard packed and so much of it, those cars just rolled right along on top of the snow, all the way down to North Berwick. I forgot how far back they found the trucks. And we had to get out well, I think, yeah, we had a Dover wrecker in those days. We had to get the wrecker out of Dover. I think they even got a wrecker out of Rigby to come down. The train master that was on the job at that time, train master or assistant superintendent, he wasn't too enthusiastic about coming out at 2:30 in the morning when it's still snowing like the dickens to go see what the problem was. He did. He came out, and that kind of tied up the Portland division for a couple of days. In fact, that switch there at North Berwick East was out of service for, about a week, as I remember it. They had to put a piece of straight rail in there. They couldn't, so that they could at least use it on the main line. We had an awful lot of snow that winter. We had cars parked all over the place. Portland couldn't take them half the time until they got the yard plowed out. Good Lord. Well, it would be like perhaps today. Oh, I think we had more snow at that time. I don't remember just what year that was.
John? I don't mean to bait you, but can you tell a story about the Wakefield wreck that Wakefield made before?
Oh, about the two bus cars?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had no more than sat down. I believe the fellow that's going to get this tape that's out in California, he was working the first big chief's job. It was on Sunday. And I relieved him. And we still had the position on the New Hampshire division desk at that time. And I was working what we call the middle position, covering, I think at that time we were working for Fitchburg and the Reading line and the Eastern Loop, I think is what I was dispatching, as well as covering the chief's job. Anyway, the telephone rings, and this voice says, "You got a head-on collision down at Sandy Beach." And he hangs up. Doesn't tell me who he is or anything else. And I'm thinking, where in tarnation is Sandy Beach? I never heard of Sandy Beach. And I got to thinking, where the heck would we have had a head-on collision with two butt cars? Well, we were running single track between Winter Hill and Winchester, because the southbound track was out of service due to construction. There was a work train out there someplace. And I'm thinking, gee whiz, the Bud car going northbound is supposed to be waiting at Winter Hill for number 918 to come south. So I called over to Don Blanchett and I says, "Hey Don, ask Mystic if he can see 123 sitting on Winter Hill, or if he's still on his board." So he called over, and the guy out to Mystic Junction says, "Yeah," he says, "he's there." He says, "I can see him." Okay. I says, "Who in the heck? I was wondering who the devil called me." So I happened to think, gee whiz, I wonder, well, if it's out that way someplace, maybe that was Winchester Police. So I called the Winchester Police. I said, "Did you just report a head-on collision at Sandy Beach?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "Where the heck is Sandy Beach?" He says, down below Wedgmere. I says, "Oh, okay." He says, "We got ambulances going down there and everything." I says, all right, thank you. So, I said to Don, I said, have you got an OS on 918 at Winchester? And he says, yeah, and he told me the time they left. I says, ask that guy at Mystic about that 123. He says, yeah, he says, I can see him, I know. He says, I can see the end of him, end of the train. And I said, something's wrong. I said, wait a minute. So I called him up on the local New England phone. I says, John, what position are your levers in at Winter Hill, your #1 crossover? He says, it's reverse. I said, and have you got the #2 signal pulled to the right? He says, yes. I said, do you have a red indication on your machine underneath that lever? Oh, yeah, I do. I says, then you don't see 123 sitting out there. He's gone. I said, don't touch your machine. Send your maintainer up to Winter Hill. So he did. He sent the maintainer up to Winter Hill, and the maintainer called back, and he says, yeah, he says, this switch out here has been run through. I said, okay, thank you. I says, you tell the maintainer to make a report on that now. Okay, well, we did, of course, in fact, have a head-on collision at Wedgemere between the 6140 and the 6130. I don't think either one of those Bud cars ran after that. And they had seen each other about in time to slow down enough. I think some, people get shaken up, but I don't believe there was anybody killed in that wreck. But,
Hospitalized.
yeah, hospitalized, but I don't think anybody was killed. But the thing of it was, why didn't we know that the train had gone? And the fellow at Mystic Junction, if it hadn't been for the fact that I told him to send his maintainer out there and check that switch, they would have blamed him for the whole thing. Because they would have figured that he had cleared the signal the other way, and there wouldn't have been anybody to dispute the fact that he didn't have that signal cleared.
I was general chairman for the dispatches at that time, and I attended both the hearings, the one the railroad held and also the one up at the State House. And I assure you they were very interesting, with the engineer of the northbound passenger trains saying that he had a high green because he trailed through a switch that was against him. And it was quite an interesting affair. And of course, the general chairman of the trainmen, he was trying to blame the railroad. In other words, put this onto the railroad, this setup that they had. I always called it, some people will know what I'm talking about, I always called this was the first unsuccessful use of the Form J train order. And there was a fellow by the name of, I think his name was Feeney, Judge Feeney, and he was some sort of a legal counsel for the trainmen. And it was kind of funny, up at the State House, he took one crew, he says, okay, now, the southbound crew, or the good guys, you're over there. Now, the other crew, you stand over there. So that left the dispatcher and the townman in the middle. We would just, whatever they could do to blame the townman or the dispatcher, that was what they were out to do. And I could see Fred Esty fidgeting at the investigation there, because Johnny Scanlon was general chairman, and he almost hit upon some little technicality that you could probably have hung the townman or the dispatcher or both. But he couldn't, not knowing enough about the operating rules, he couldn't quite get his hand on the jug handle there to put that in. He tried. After the hearing was over, Fred said, boy, he says, did you see the way Scanlon, he almost made it that time? I said, I know he almost made it. But anyway, they both continued to work, because it was a case of going by a red signal, and the switch was reversed. It was a good thing the switch was reversed, because there had been no proof. The townman would have had no proof. It was his word against a couple of men on an engine, or the train crew, whatever it was. So the other two big wrecks, well, the one that 302 at Nashway, tipping over at Nashway, going around the curve, and rolling the engines over and tipping the RPO up on the roof. And that was a real big medieval mess. And then the other one, I just sat down one night at Concord when 325 come up to South Lowell. UB2 was backing off in the yard. They split the switch. They put a tank car out in front of 325. 325 hit it. One of his coaches went partway into the river. And the head end, they had a 4200, one of those 4226 engines. And he plowed a big furrow. And they had some deadhead sleepers on there, which when the slack ran in, they took a wooden baggage car, took it out of the train and smashed it over the front end of a diesel switcher that was sitting over there in the yard at the bleachery there. And that started right about, you know, like 11 o'clock at night there, just after I went to work. So that provided a pretty full evening, I should say. But most of the wrecks that usually many of them were man failure, or a lot of them are equipment failure too, especially these burned off journals and things like that. And you hated to see them. You hated to see the, you know, the destruction and somebody getting into trouble. You never enjoyed, at least I never did, I never enjoyed anybody getting into trouble, whether they were an engineman. In fact, I almost got into trouble myself once. 351, they started north out of Concord, and they were going to meet the Milk Extra south at, I guess, Mascoma. And I had an order out at Halcyon for them. Red board and hand signals. And unbeknown to me, because of course this was before the days of radio, 351 went into garage to let 325 go by. So 325 came up and stopped, so we gave them a Form A, no orders, and they went along, which according to the rules, that was just the way it should be done. So anyway, when 351 came up, I can hear B. Heflin now. She was the lady operator at Halcyon. She come on, she says, they went right by. Went right by. That's terrible. So anyway, then she came on again. She says they're coming back. So well, needless to say, nothing happened. They got the order. The meat wasn't that bad. And for some unknown reason, I didn't write it up. So it wasn't a couple of days later, they were pretty upset about this, that I hadn't made a report of this. So when they had the investigation, of course, I was quite happy when they read the train orders and everything that happened, that I had done it according to the rules, because actually the head end man, he had been all day at the Leahy Clinic. He was asleep. The fireman, of course, was back in the units, and the engineer, I forget what his excuse was. The iron bar, Ed Pelletier, he was the conductor, and he saw the red board. He pulled the air. They only had, it was Sunday night, they only had a few cars, so they could back up and get the order and go along. So I remember Ed was kind of a comical guy there. And the superintendent took after him in the investigation for backing the train up with no authority. So he said something about, well, he says, right there south of Halcyon, he says, there's a double green block. We had a double green block. We couldn't see any problem backing up a few car lengths. Well, he says, that double green block doesn't give you any authority to back up. Well, he says, it would if we were going the other way. So that kind of closed off the investigation. One of the best investigations I went to was one time when somebody out in Fitchburg decided they would go from, from Hoosick Junction to Williamstown against the current of traffic with no orders. And so the superintendent held the investigation, and each member of the train crew had his own representative. The engineers, the firemen, and the conductor, and they had two other guys. And they were all there. I was representing the dispatcher. So anyway, it kept on and on and on. It was going for hours. It was up in East Deerfield. And so finally, the best part about the whole thing was, toward the end of it there, the superintendent happened to look, and the tape recorder hadn't been working right. So I tell you, There was a lot of protests, the hearing's no unfair, everybody went back to work, thanks to a tape recorder going on the bunk.
I remember,
How long do we want to carry this on? Does anybody want to ask some questions? Maybe somebody's got some questions that
Everybody want to ask.
Sure, what do you say?
What was the result of that investigation of that Canadian train that tipped over at Medford there when he went over onto a parallel track?
they were
And the
rebuilding.
engine tipped over on the crossing of the bridge.
Yeah, that was part,
What caused it?
I think that was the railroad's fault. They had put a detour to rebuild that bridge, Harvard Street Bridge. They put a detour to come through the sidetrack and come around it. And the bulletin, evidently, that was on the bulletin board at White River was misplaced. And when the crew went to work in the morning, they did not see the bulletin. But I think it was poor railroading to get clear signals to go into a detour when they could have had it like a yellow-red, which he had to slow down to anyway. But he came down there on a double green. He hadn't seen the bulletin in the White River, so as soon as he went in there, he rolled him over.
They said there was a sign stuck up in the ground there somewhere for him to.
There was a slow board, but when you're coming down there 70 miles an hour, if you don't have, with a double green signal. Yeah, Donald.
Yeah, in 1955, I was working on the Nantasket steamer as an oiler. And we went into one of the Charlestown piers where the Boston, Maine had a special train come in, and we loaded the passengers off that special train, took them down Nantasket Beach, and then brought them back in late in the afternoon, early evening. Do you know anything about where that train might have come from and what it was, and whether the train was on a charter or anything about it?
I know at one time, back around that time, they had a special train that took in all the railroad facilities in Greater Boston. They took in Mystic Wharf, they went to the B&A piers, they went all around. It might have been in conjunction with something like that, that this was part of the, entertainment, or part of the, so we say, some sort of a recreation part of it.
Preston, that didn't happen. I ran those trains in tank. We never did that.
Never did that?
That was industrial, to show industrial sites around the city.
Right.
And it was done by the Eastern Railroad President's Conference and
Okay.
in conjunction with the three railroads, B&A, New Haven, and us. And
I still got the brochure they put out.
yeah, that was not in the package.
Okay.
Was that the Gillette safety razor extra that ran down that he's talking about?
I don't remember.
Because
Plus, in those days, you had a lot of extra trains. You had, Exeter Academy would have a train taking the kids home on their holidays, and
Well, I remember those.
all kinds of extra trains. In fact, there was something in those instructions from Dover that used to say that when it looks like 12 cars or more on an excursion train, run them in 2 sections. And another little thing in those instructions, it said it was permissible to have a train run from Boston to Portland via the Western Route in 1 hour and 50 minutes. That's what 15 used to make it in, the tin can, but 1 hour and 50 minutes, you could run it on an extra train.
He used to build a steam when the steam was on that train.
Right, yep.
I remember doing it on a Preston and Harrison excursion one time behind a J1.
Any stories or anything about that Superintendent Barrett?
Walter Barrett? Oh, yeah. Yeah, there was a real, he came from Chicago. Hanover brought him from Chicago with the Kaiser, which was Heine Kruger the first, Henry Kruger's dad. And he became superintendent of the terminal division. And he was quite a character. He always wore a nice, sort of a light gray Homburg hat, and he always wore what I always used to call an undertaker's coat with the shiny lapels and stuff like that. But he wasn't one bit bashful. Like when we'd have an oil train coming into Tower H, back during the war, some of the oil trains, if you had a straight train of oil going to Esso over in Beacon Park, over in East Everett there, where the fruit place is now, the produce places. They would come in the main line, go into Tower H, the switcher would be up in the paint shop, take the hind end off and shove it in on the B&A. Then the B&A would take the train from L&F Junction over and deliver it over there, because it was B&A Railroad over there. So anyway, if Barrett was out there and one of those jobs was coming in, he'd get right up on top of a tank car with a fusee if it was nighttime, or a silk handkerchief, and give motions. No radios in those days. I saw him up to the hump one day, and they had a spare engineer on one of those 600s. The guy was having a terrible time trying to get this drag pulled out of the hump. So Barrett went right down there, tapped the engineer on the shoulder. He says, "Son," everybody was son, "son, I'll show you how to do this." So all dressed up there, boy, he yarded them out there, pulled them up over the hump there, and he was, whenever Frank Brooks says, "Walter, BM3 leaves Boston on time tonight," Walter was there, and BM3 left Boston on time. Because he really, if Frank Brooks told him to do something, he was right there. But he was a very fair superintendent. He was a gentleman, and as you know, maybe some of you know, he dropped dead right in the office during a big blizzard.
I can tell you of an experience I had with Walter Barrett. I could tell you two. One of them was when I was working third trick at Mystic Junction. He stayed with me all night long through a blizzard. The next, I went home, I came back. The next night, he was still in that tower. And he spent the next night with me in the tower. What he was doing was overseeing the whole yard, because from Mystic Junction Tower, you could see all over the place and watch the whole operation. But what I was going to tell you was when I was working Tower C as a director one time on the second trick, it was at the change of time in the spring. And we had then a director and a sheet man who sat side by side of what we called the pulpit, and we had two levermen down on the machine. And Tower C, for those of you who are not familiar, was located right near East Somerville. We controlled the trains in and out of Boston on the western and the eastern route, plus we ran the trains down to Mystic Wharf and the freight trains. The yard drags out from either yard 8 or yard 9 down past us out to yard 21. Well, anyway, we had a job we used to call the high car job, or the Reading local. They used to go to Reading in the morning and then over the Newburyport and Salem branches over to Salem and come back again. Well, I had just come to work, and the sheet man says, "I got the high car job just coming in from Wakefield Junction, about 40 cars. I said, "Okay, fine." I looked at the clock and I said, "Well, gee, he's early today." So I said, "He's ahead of 152. Well, fine. A little while later, the bell rings in at Oak Grove. I called the move for the train to come down as far as what we called D4 signal, which was the last signal he would get on the main line before he went into the yard. And he comes down to D4, it did, and I called D4 to YD and up 21. No, train comes down and he sits there, whistles out a flag. I thought, well, gee whiz, the signal must be out. So I said to the leverman, I says, "Go to the window, you've got it lined up, haven't you?" And he says, "Yeah." He says, "Everything's all lined up for him." Go to the window and give him a motion to come along. So he goes out to the window, and this was steam era days, and all I could see was the very front of the locomotive. So the fella goes out, gives him a hand motion, and just as the engine made the turn, and behind the engine I see a bunch of passenger cars, I says, "Oh, nuts." So I run down the stairs, I said to the fellow, I said, "Give him the R-78 to the Medford, will you?" He said, "Okay." So that was the signal behind him. I swung up the train, gave him a big backup motion. The engineer stops the train, whistles 3, backs the train up. I says to haul it up to the fellow, I said, "As soon as he clears your crossover, give him D4 to 4. That sends him into the North Station." So they did. I get back up into the tower. The sheet man says, Mr. Barrett wants to talk to you. Huh? Okay. So I pick up the phone. He says, are you the director? Yes, sir. What's your name? Don Hills. Oh, how are you today? I said, well, right now, not too good. He says, what happened? So I told him. I said, I thought it was a high car job coming along. It turned out to be 152. I was like, a little confused on the time here, on account of the change of time. Well, he says, okay. Well, then we had a job come up from the wharf, and I called him up to go up in the yard 9. The tail end of that job didn't clear. The switches up in back of us. Meanwhile, the local freight shows up. So he rang me up and he says, son, you got a freight train standing out here now? I said, yes, I know, but I said, that job that just went up from the wharf, I said, the tail end doesn't clear, so we gotta get a hold of Yard 9 and ask him to pull him up for it. Okay. I never heard another thing about delaying that train at Tower C going in. Not a thing. Today, for crying out loud, they'd have a major investigation on something like that. I probably delayed the train 5 minutes.
They had a case one time, one of the guys in Tower 8 put 59, the Minuteman, and headed him toward Yard 4 in error. And Barrett said to him, you know, I'm surprised at you, Jimmy, an old-time townman like you putting the Minuteman into Yard 4. He says, Mr. Barrett, you weren't half as surprised as I was when I saw him going in there. But there was a lot of good times on the railroad. There were a lot of good stories and a lot of things that, there was tragedies, there were things that were sad and things like that, but in most cases, everybody had a lot of fun, and it was interesting to work for. It was a good company to work for. Ed French and Chagru, and in that era, there were nice people to work for. And it was surprising the amount of business they did. We had all these crazy little runs, like the train that came down from Newburyport in the morning went as far as the General Electric at Lynn. Then you had the train that started out of the United Shoe in the afternoon and picked up the agent and took him to Beverly and the passengers that worked in the shoe and took them along. Then you had, one time there was a passenger train that ran between Lawrence and Shawsheen to pick up the mill people in the afternoon. And the cab train between North Lawrence and South Lawrence. There was all kinds of little odd type of things, where today all you have is a string of cars going out and coming back. And of course the equipment in those days was interesting there with the milk and the express. In this book I have from Dover, there are all kinds of instructions of what to do with the milk cars and what to do with the mail cars. And at Christmas time, with everything running in sections, you might have as many as, 10 different trains the day before Christmas, like the Concord train, number 5307, the Portland trains, that all be running in sections. You just look back and you wonder, where the heck did they ever get all this equipment? When you see today passenger trains coming out of Wakefield with people standing, and a job out of Attleboro that stands 250 people every day. You say, where did all this disappear to? And all the business they did, and the troop trains and things like that, they just send a message to the engine house.
Camp trains in the summertime.
Provide P4 engine and engine crew for this and that. It was just understood. They just did it. I got the list of all the camp trains for 1956 and 57 at home, all the register slips and the consists and everything like that. And in 1956, there were 20 camp extras running out of Worcester in that 3-day period.
Plus, we had plenty of them on the Conn River, too. And of course, I remember one car used to show up out of New York every year on the day White Mountains Express, along about the 1st of August. The New Haven used to put a sign in the window of the coaches when they assigned the car to a special party. And you could read from the outside. And I remember every year, just about the same time, up would come this car headed for Littleton and Bethlehem for the Hebrew Hay Fever Relief Association. Press was talking about getting BM3 out of town on time. It's a good thing he didn't have Rufus Maxfield for an engineer. Rufus had a reputation, and you would always ask. Yes, I can see Elmer looking. I can always remember you'd ask Fitchburg, "How's MP2 doing?" "Rufus is pumping," and he would pump air until he got his terminal overtime. If his connection from the west was late, you sent him back. He would sit there in Fitchburg and pump air for anywhere from 2 to 3 hours until he got his terminal overtime. Then he would go. If you had missed and forgotten to set him back, and they came in a couple of hours behind the time that he had gone on duty, he wouldn't be on that train 20 minutes before he'd be on his way out of town. But he held the record, because one day he sat there and pumped air for 16 hours and canned without ever turning a wheel.
Also, too, tell me that time about the stock cars and so on that, that would find their way into the railroad from time to time, that watering stock, feeding stock, and so on.
Well, we used to have
Loaded
a lot
fed
of
water,
a lot of any DMW, New England Dressed Meat and Wool in Somerville. And there was hardly a train out of Mechanicville that didn't have stock on it. And of course, being on the tag end of the trip, you had to watch it because it was 36 hours and then they had to be unloaded for feed and water, and it didn't make any difference where the hell they were at the end of that 36 hours. They might be if they were in the middle of downtown Fitchburg, when that 36 hours ran out, you had to unload them and feed them and water them. So you were very careful to see that anything that had that on it. I can remember 2 occasions when I was working at Crescent Tower that the D&H ran a special 1-car train from Binghamton to Mechanicville because the car had been set out at Binghamton with a hot box and they had repaired it, and they caught up at Mechanicville with the group of cars that it had been with, and went back, engine and buggy, to Binghamton, and the D&H figured it had saved money.
They used to always come in the Mystic on the tail end, and they'd have a switcher right there ready to pluck them off, toss them down 9, another guy would grab them and take them up to the paint shop, up to the Bull House they called it. Harry Page was night train master, and the first of the evening he'd check with the chief in Greenfield, and they'd say, "Harry, we got some 5:45 a.m. stock on there this morning, and it's going to be awful close." Harry says, "Don't worry about it," he says. "If we don't have time to set it with a switcher, we'll set it with a pencil."
Probably a good bit of it was, too,
But of course, in those days, there were several things. The short time stock, there was fruit that came in that had to make the auction over at Rutherford Avenue. And if the stuff didn't get there in time for the auction, there was a penalty that the railroad paid on the difference of what they sold it after the auction and what they could get. This was all part of an agreement to fight for this business so you could get this fruit. And then another thing was the short time stock, and then another thing, the Union Freight meat. There was several consignees on the Union Freight that got fresh meat that came in on the various ways. And the Union Freight made their last trip like about 7 in the morning because of the traffic and one thing. They didn't want them down Atlantic Avenue. So there was, and then, let's see, the milk was important. And then the other thing was the Fords. The railroad used to have Ford parts come on the Rutland, the CV, and from the D&H and the New York Central. They all came in different routes, so they would get to the assembly plant. And the Ford company knew where every one of those cars were. They could call up and they'd say, "DTI such and such is a load of frames. We get them this morning or we don't run the plant." It'd be pretty hard to make the automobiles without the frames. So anyway, this was stuff that they really checked up on. And the railroad was really right on top of this. They were, well, Ford was giving them, I think, close to 15 or 16,000 cars a year. First National was giving them 10,000 cars a year. The consignees in Boston were unbelievable. And on third trick, sometimes you'd have the humpers, and you'd have a yard 10 engine that handled milk, you'd have a yard 7 engine, an A-house engine, an engine down on Mystic Wharf, an engine in yard 21, an engine at the Avenue. And with the passenger switches, some nights it'd be 10 engines, 10 or 12 engines that worked in the Boston yard. And all this today, as everybody knows, is all gone. And you wonder where all this evaporated to in such a short period of time. But I think they took a great pride in their service. In fact, every so often Frank Rook would get in the act and he would say, effective at once, you can hold 106 at Haverhill no more than 5 minutes for number 22, which was an express train, but they wanted the commuter trains on time. And when 302...
That was where the bitchin' came from.
Right. And if 302, which served as a commuter train from Concord to Boston, if they were going to be over 30 minutes late, you set up a section out of Concord, because we had a set of bud cars that laid over there, and you'd run a crew into Boston, and then you'd bring the bud cars back. So, and you just didn't take a chance. If you'd hate to see them right on the line, you'd rather see them right on time or 40 minutes late, then you set up the section. Now, speaking of the holidays, I think one of the more interesting things that happened on one of the holidays, it was Christmas Eve. And there was a train that went from Boston to North Conway. It was a bud train. And it ran Christmas Eve. But it did not run back Christmas Day. The run went up Christmas Eve, and there was nothing for the crew to do. But on a normal weekday, of course, they'd go up, they'd take rest, and come back the next morning. They couldn't find an engineer to run this particular train. I don't know if it was 2917, it was some one of those numbers like that. So they got a hold of an engineer, and they asked him if he would take it. He says, you know, he says, I'll take it under one consideration. He said, I want to be home for Christmas. So Fred Esty was the superintendent. He says, you know, he says, we can probably fix that up for you. He says, would your wife drive down to Dover and pick you up? Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, I'll tell you what we'll do. You take the bud car home for Christmas. So we went up to North Conway and loaded the passengers. He and the flagman took the bud car back to Dover, and he had Christmas at home. First time I ever knew of a guy taking the train home for Christmas. That size, that is. But they made all kinds of little agreements like that. They, the crews would ask little favors, whether they could deadhead, go home for the weekend, or deadhead up on some train, and they'd even set trains back, freight trains back, maybe 3 or 4 hours, so that the crew could deadhead back after Christmas and run the train out. Now, of course, they just cancel everything on holidays. Nothing runs on a holiday now to speak of, so they don't have the problem. Marty?
About the tight schedule they set up and trying to really market the piggybacks in the early 60s. You delayed the PB 100 out of the yard 7, 3 minutes before the bring it.
Speaking of wrecks and PB 99, that brings up a very, very interesting subject. They had a wreck in Mechanicville, and the wrecker, the Deerfield wrecker, was in Mechanicville. So Tom Bolt said, sometime tonight when you get a crew, bring it back to East Deerfield. So I says, okay. So they had a crew with rest up, shall we say, at 8:30 at night or something like that. So we ordered the wrecker. PB 99 went by Greenfield about 8:30 or something like that. And he got up around Buckland and he derailed quite a few of the piggybacks. And right away, Tom knew about it. We told him about it like that. He says, well, what about the wrecker? I said, oh, I says, you might say we could see this coming. I says, I ordered the wrecker to leave Mechanicville at the same time they got wrecked. What do you say, Donald? You got a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, does the dispatcher of one railroad have some sort of a interface with the dispatcher of another railroad in a place like, say that, like a place like South Sudbury where the New Haven, line going up to Lowell across the Central Mass, for example, or the Grand Junction going through the big yard complex from Somerville there. How would you, Kevin, would you have to set it up with the B&A guys or the New Haven guys that replaced it? They would have a freight train schedule, or would you just depend on the single?
Well, it depends on who owns the railroad. Now, like when you worked at Tower H, of course, you favored the B&M over the B&A, because that wasn't really dispatcher's territory. But before a train, like to go to the CP or something, before a train can go to another railroad, they're always notified and told that they're coming so that they can arrange their works too, the same as if they give us a train.
Today, the principal places that sort of thing happens are either Crescent, where you go to and from the D&H, or Rotterdam Junction, where you go to and from Conrail. There isn't that much traffic, really, that interchange, well, no, there isn't actually that much traffic that interchanges. Of course, you do in a sense at Rigby, because you change dispatchers there, and there aren't any trains that go through Rigby. They have all are handled there. But there isn't that much traffic anymore at Springfield. And we do talk to St. Albans as far as stuff at White River and East Northfield are concerned, but there again, it's only a couple of trains in each direction a day. Principal points of receipt and deliveries are Crescent and Rotterdam right now, Crescent and Rotterdam Junction right now.
No, I didn't mean interchange. I meant where you simply have a foreign roads train that's going to cross through the railroad.
Oh, as far as that's concerned, the dispatchers will probably talk to each other. That'd be up to the towerman. Unless, of course, the dispatcher was controlling the machine, and then he'd talk to, he might talk to the other man, but it would be more or less as towerman to towerman rather than dispatcher to dispatcher. Even though it was the dispatchers who were doing the talking.
I guess what I'm thinking of specifically is the Conrail switch that comes up from Beacon Park, goes over to Chelsea.
Well, hell, once he leaves Beacon Park, he's, it's goodbye, we'll see you when you get back. The dispatcher doesn't care where he is. He knows he's on that line, that's all he...
You mean the Conrail dispatcher?
Yeah.
I'm talking about the Boston Maine dispatcher.
Conrail dispatcher or the B&M dispatcher, they don't care. Don't either one of them give a damn.
That's a yard.
That's a yard move. Dispatcher doesn't care. Dispatcher doesn't care a damn thing about it.
Yeah, but how do you keep him out of the way?
The towermen keep him out of the way. We don't care. That's up to Tower X and Tower H to worry about. Well, Cross 7 isn't involved in so much in it, but
Ross 7 one time had a holding signal. That B&A branch going across the pond, go back to Beacon Park, at the channel train. Driving all across 7 for an hour and a half, 2 hours.
what do you say, Bill?
Why is Westboro Engine House called Westboro?
Because it's West Lebanon. But when they renamed all the stations after the 1909 wreck, West Lebanon became Westboro. And the passenger station is still there. It's the American Legion Hall. And that is Westboro. But as far as the railroad is concerned, but it is the village of West Lebanon.
But speaking of unusual things between dispatchers and the railroad, at about 5 o'clock this morning, the Conrail dispatcher in Springfield started getting fussy about a maintainer in truck 411. And he says, well, what's the matter with the switch? And normally they're very much in control. These guys control one line and everything is very routine with them. And he says, well, just where are you? And I couldn't hear the other end of this. So there was a long pause between each of these, and finally he says, well, until you tell me who you are and where you are, I can't help you. And where is the Wildcat? Oh God, that happened this morning. The only thing I can figure out is some radio maintenance guy got the wrong radio in the right truck. But something happened.
Well, I tell you, there was one night in Greenfield, back when we were, still had the run-through power from the Lackawanna on the piggyback trains. And the frequency with the D&H and us was so close that once in a while, when things were just right, we'd pick up the D&H. I was sitting in Greenfield one night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, dead in the doornail. Wasn't a thing going on. RW6 to dispatcher. Well, RW6 is a D&H, Rouse's Point to Wilkes-Barre at that time. And we didn't hear the other end, but apparently the dispatcher answered him. Yeah, we got them all stacked up here north of Port Henry. Apparently the dispatcher asked him if he needed the record. Need the record? We need 3 records. And that was the last we heard. I saw Marv, what is his name of the road foreman there? I can't think.
Marv Davis?
Yes, Marv Davis. Sometime later, and I asked him about it. He said, yeah. He said they had 23 cars in 5 car lengths. The rest of it was up. What do you say, Doug?
Yeah, we're ready to move on to the next thing. I have a question. Would either or all of you like to give some of your personality remembrances about local division superintendent Charlie Kane?
Well, my first
I know you've got a story to tell.
my first recollection of Charlie Kane was before, came before I worked for the railroad. And I was going to Exeter Academy. It happened to be a Wednesday afternoon when we didn't have any classes. And I was up to the station, or actually at Front Street Crossing, and I suddenly realized that they were flagging down one of the eastbound expresses. So I jumped on my bicycle and headed up that way to find out what was going on. For whatever reason, they were stopping him to back him over the crossover onto the westbound track and send him east on the westbound. And anyway, Charlie Kane was there. I didn't know who Charlie Kane was. All I knew was that he was somebody this person was somebody that was in my way on the platform. I nearly took him right with me with my bicycle. I soon found out who Charlie Kane was. Unfortunately, the agent, who was Fred Kemp, you remember that name, Elmer? Knew who I was. And he told Charlie, and I got strict orders to keep my bicycle the hell off of the platform.
I never worked under Charlie Kane. I had met him a couple of times. He was the superintendent in Dover, but from what I've heard about him, I think he was a real good straight shooter. Quite a few stories about him and the way he handled things. I know he wrote a little note one time there about something about if they keep delaying such and such a train, somebody's going to walk the plank. So, he was a little straightforward, I guess, in his comments, and I think he was maybe like Walter Barrett. He was a good superintendent.
My only other recollection of Charlie Kane was on a railroad enthusiast excursion. We had a B-15 and 7 open platform cars. Started out by going from Boston to Rockport, back to Salem, then to Portsmouth, over the M&P to Manchester, back the M&L to Lawrence, and back into Boston. Well, they had assigned various engineers and conductors as required by the seniority districts. But the brakemen and the firemen had been assigned for all day. Well, with the B-15 and 7 cars, by the time we left Epping, headed for Manchester, that poor fireman had blisters the size of $50 on his hands. They ordered a new fireman for Manchester, and when we got over there, they found out they didn't have one. Well, I still have the hat badge that I had in those days, which says Railroad Enthusiast Flagman on it. And I used to, as George Becker always used to fire the engines, so I always used to ride either the lead coach or the engine and flag crossings. And I had been flagging crossings across the M&P, and we started down the M&L. Charlie Kane took over as the fireman. He said, the regular fireman, the guy with the blisters, said, "I'll get you over the hill up to Londonderry." But he said, "From there on, I'm done." So Charlie came, took over as flagman. Well, of course, there were quite a few crossings to flag down the branch there, and coming into Lawrence, this was before the days when the state passed a law that gates had to be lowered for the passage of all trains. So when there wasn't a crossing watchman on duty, you just went out there and waved your red flag and went across with the gates up in the air. But at Broadway in Lawrence, there was a special instruction in the back of the timetable relative to the fact that there were traffic lights on that crossing, and before flagging it, you were to go over to the base of the crossing tender's tower and throw a switch, which would put the traffic lights red. So we came down into Lawrence and stopped short of Essex Street because you couldn't fit the train in between the two. And Charlie says to me, he says, "You take care of this one, I'll go take care of Broadway." I said, "Don't forget the traffic lights." He said something was bleep the traffic lights.